Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we are diving into a truly fascinating conceptual shift in modern science. We're looking at something called the Scale Regulated Aggregation, or SRA framework, developed by Savio Antonio Vogt. And the story here is incredible. For a solid decade, this work faced almost constant rejection. But it has recently transitioned into a massive breakthrough in our understanding of deterministic stability. Vogt really sits squarely in that grand lineage of independent scientific visionaries. Think of brilliant outsiders like Oliver Heaviside or Nikola Tesla, people working on the periphery of traditional academia to solve the problems everyone else is stuck on. Today, we're going to figure out exactly why our most complex scientific models keep breaking down, and how Vogt framework provides a brilliant structural resolution to some of the world's most persistent mathematical pathologies. So here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the problem of unregulated accumulation. Second, the scale-regulated aggregation framework itself. Third, the universal safety switch. Fourth, cross-domain stress testing. And finally, restraint over new physics. All right, let's jump right into part one, the problem of unregulated accumulation. I want you to really think about this for a second. What on earth do turbulent fluid flows, sudden financial market crashes, and cosmological black holes actually have in common? At first glance, Wall Street and the event horizon of a black hole share absolutely zero similarities, right? One is driven by human psychology and capital, the other by extreme gravity and mass. But structurally, mathematically, they actually share a fatal mathematical flaw in how we model them. That flaw is divergence. Basically, divergence is the exact moment when a complex system just spins completely out of control. It happens when our assumption of endless, additive accumulation temporarily exceeds a system's true regulatory capacity. In our mathematical models, we often just kind of lazily assume things will keep adding up nicely forever. But, nature doesn't work like that. Whether it's energy compounding in a turbulent fluid or panic multiplying in a stock market, when accumulation goes completely unchecked by any sort of regulation, the math explodes into absurd infinities. And in reality, the system crashes. What happens is we fall into a massive conceptual trap. We take a perfectly good physical law that works locally, say in a tiny controlled space, and we make a huge, dangerous assumption. We assume this accumulation rule is additive by default, everywhere, forever. We extrapolate a tiny local truth across an entire, massive scale, leading to a global assumption that is fundamentally broken. We just assume that because a rule works beautifully in a microcosm, its effects are going to compound infinitely without ever hitting a structural limit. Which brings us to section 2, the scale-regulated aggregation framework. Let's see how we fix this. Now, Vogt proposes something super interesting here. At the micro level, at a really small scale, simple local addition works just fine. Additive behavior absolutely dominates. But at a large scale, the rules of the game have to change to maintain stability. A built-in, multiplicative regulation kicks in to stabilize things over long distances. It's exactly like a physical governor on an engine. It steps in to prevent the system from just revving itself into total destruction. Vogt mathematically formalizes this concept as the AM regulator, that stands for additive multiplicative regulator. And the crucial thing is, you shouldn't think of this as some brand new mysterious physical force. It's actually an embedded structural operator. It links that initial additive growth with a multiplicative feedback loop to enforce scale-dependent stability. This regulator essentially acts as a universal safety switch. It produces bounded, stable dynamics instead of those catastrophic, system-destroying singularities we see in older models. Let's move right into section 3 to see how this works in practice. The universal safety switch. So this AM regulator basically creates what we can call a graceful failure, or a controlled breakdown across completely different physical regimes. Whether you're looking at turbulence, where energy safely saturates instead of causing a spectral breakdown, or black holes, where the boundary structures saturation past the event horizon. It even applies to cosmological expansion, avoiding thermal divergence. And honestly, the wildest part? It even works in pure mathematics, right at the critical threshold of prime numbers. Where traditional models hit a divergent breakdown and essentially snap, the AM regulator gracefully caps the accumulation, keeping everything mathematically sound. So why does this framework survive rigorous statistical scrutiny where so many others just fall apart? Well, instead of exploding into crazy mathematical infinities, the descriptive framework just gracefully saturates. It signals that its classical geometry has simply reached its natural limit. It doesn't arrogantly demand to be universal, and it actually predicts exactly where it's going to break down. It leaves the simple additive models alone where they empirically work. And crucially, and this is that true discipline of restraint we talked about, it introduces absolutely zero new imaginary particles or hidden dimensions just to make the math work. It just smoothly exits the descriptive regime. Okay, let's stress test this. Section 4, cross-domain stress testing. To prove this isn't just some abstract mathematical trick, let's look at economics. We can actually map out systemic macroeconomic instability using what are called lambda bands, essentially a metric of system stress. This maps out exactly how economic systems drift from completely safe equilibrium basins through standard business cycles into macro stress, and then, if the metric exceeds 1.5, straight into a chaotic crisis attractor. By applying the AM regulator, we can actually measure and predict the exact moment when the additive growth of a market is going to totally overwhelm its regulatory capacity. And honestly, the empirical verifications go way, way beyond economics. Across 18 incredibly different domains, this exact same structural pattern of regulated accumulation emerged. We are literally talking about everything from the scale-constrained cost curves of deep space rocket payloads to the saturated stability of global financial futures markets. It even applies perfectly to biology. The incredibly chaotic energy landscape of complex protein folding and the exponential divergence of multicellular growth both perfectly mirror this regulated basin convergence. It's an absolutely stunning validation of the framework across totally unrelated fields. Finally, let's wrap up with Section 5, Restraint over New Physics. This really brings us to the philosophical climax of the whole framework. Usually, when scientific theories fail at large scales, when things break down, we absolutely panic. Our first instinct in academia is often to modify the laws entirely, or worse, to invent totally imaginary new entities just to plug the holes in our math. We invent dark matter, we add extra dimensions, we dream up new subatomic forces. But Vogt suggests a much, much more restrained approach. Instead of inventing ghosts to fix the math, simply re-examine our foundational assumptions about how things accumulate in the first place. This is the ultimate choice facing science right now. On one hand, you have ontological expansion, which is just a fancy way of saying we force new invisible entities into existence just to make our legacy math work. Or we can choose structural clarification, acknowledging the actual limits of our models through tools like the AM regulator. This framework is a massive victory for the discipline of restraint. It's championed by that exact lineage of independent visionaries outside the mainstream, the Heavisides and Teslas of the world, who were able to see the underlying structural connections that highly siloed traditional academics so often miss. Vogt writes something that really hits the nail on the head. He says the future of theoretical science may not depend on larger frameworks. It may depend on quieter ones. This powerful idea perfectly embodies that discipline of restraint. This theory survives a decade of intense scrutiny precisely because it doesn't try to arrogantly explain every single thing in the cosmos. It doesn't try to rewrite the universe. Rather, it deeply understands its own profound boundaries. It relies entirely on geometric admissibility rather than endlessly chasing mathematical infinity. Constraint before accumulation. Admissibility before infinity. I really want to leave you with that thought. How might embracing this kind of disciplined restraint fundamentally change the way we model the most extreme, chaotic, and beautiful phenomena on our universe? If we just stop assuming that nature grows without limits, what new, stable realities might we discover right in front of us? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope this sparked your curiosity as much as it did mine.